You won't believe what happened when urban explorers finally entered room 237 of Waverly Hills Sanatorium after it had been sealed for 64 years. But before I tell you what they found, you need to understand why this room was locked in the first place. Waverly Hills Sanatorium sits on a windswept hill in Kentucky, and it's considered one of the most haunted places in America. But this isn't just some ghost story. This is the true account of a medical facility that became a house of horrors, where over 60,000 people died within its walls, and where the staff went to unimaginable lengths to hide what was really happening inside. Construction began in 1910, designed to house tuberculosis patients during the deadliest epidemic in American history. Tuberculosis, or the White Death as it was called, was killing 1 in 7 people in the United States. There was no cure, no treatment. If you caught it, you were sent to Waverly Hills to die. The hospital was built to hold 40 patients. Within 2 years, it held over 400. By 1926, it was expanded to accommodate more than 500 patients, but even that wasn't enough. At its peak, Waverly Hills was treating over 800 patients simultaneously, cramming them into rooms designed for half that number. The overcrowding made the disease spread faster. The death rate skyrocketed. Here's what makes this story even darker. In 1928, the hospital director made a decision that would haunt Waverly Hills forever. He ordered the construction of a secret tunnel. Now, hospitals have tunnels all the time, right? For supplies, for staff to move between buildings. But this tunnel was different. It was 500 feet long, leading from the hospital down the hill to the railroad tracks below. The official story was that it would make transporting supplies easier during Kentucky's harsh winters, but that was a lie. This tunnel had a completely different purpose. And what that purpose was tells you everything you need to know about what was really happening inside Waverly Hills. You see, by 1928, patients were dying at a rate of 1 per hour. The bodies were piling up so fast that the staff couldn't handle it. But here's the thing that management was terrified about. The patients who were still alive were watching. They saw the bodies being wheeled out the front entrance day after day, hour after hour, and it was destroying whatever hope they had left. So the director came up with a solution. The tunnel wasn't for supplies, it was for bodies. They started calling it the Body Chute, or the Death Tunnel. Every single day, dozens of corpses were loaded onto a motorized rail car and sent down through this tunnel, out of sight of the living patients. The bodies would slide down into the darkness, where they'd be loaded into unmarked vehicles and driven away. But the patients weren't stupid. They heard the rumbling beneath their feet. They heard the rail car moving at all hours of the night. And they knew their friends, their roommates, the person in the bed next to them was being secretly hauled away like garbage in the middle of the night. The psychological torture of that tunnel might have killed as many people as the disease itself. Now here's where things get disturbing. In room 502, on the top floor of Waverly Hills, something happened in 1928 that the hospital tried to cover up for decades. A nurse who worked in that room was found dead, hanging from the light fixture. The official report said suicide. But here's what doesn't make sense. This nurse was 29 years old. She was unmarried and pregnant, which in 1928 was a devastating scandal. But witnesses reported seeing her just hours before her death, and she seemed fine, happy even. Some staff members later claimed she had been involved in illegal experiments on patients. Others said she had discovered something about the hospital's operations that someone wanted to keep quiet. 2 weeks after her body was found, all records related to her death disappeared from the hospital files. But that's not the end of room 502's story. In 1932, just 4 years later, another nurse died in that exact same room. This nurse jumped from the window, falling 5 stories to her death, or at least that's what the official report says. But multiple witnesses claimed they saw her being pushed. The hospital administration ruled it a suicide within 24 hours without an investigation. After that second death, room 502 was permanently closed. It was locked, the windows were sealed, and staff were forbidden from entering. For over 6 decades, that room sat untouched while the rest of the hospital continued operating around it. What could possibly be in that room that required it to be sealed for 64 years? But before I tell you what urban explorers found when they finally broke into room 502 in 1996, you need to know about the medical experiments that were happening at Waverly Hills. Because what the doctors were doing to patients here would be considered torture by today's standards. Remember, there was no cure for tuberculosis in the 1920s and 30s. So doctors at Waverly Hills were trying anything, no matter how brutal. One of the most common treatments was called pneumothorax. Doctors would surgically collapse a patient's lung, believing that resting the lung would allow it to heal. Patients would live for months with only one functioning lung, gasping for air, drowning slowly. Most died anyway. But that wasn't the worst of it. Another treatment involved removing ribs. Doctors would cut open a patient's chest and remove multiple ribs, allowing the chest cavity to collapse inward, supposedly giving the lungs more room to expand. Patients were awake during these procedures, screaming in agony because anesthesia was in short supply. Then there was heliotherapy. Patients, even in the freezing Kentucky winters, were wheeled out onto the open-air porches and left there for hours, sometimes days. The theory was that fresh air and sunlight would kill the bacteria. Instead, patients froze to death, their bodies found covered in snow, still strapped to their beds. The hospital kept meticulous records of these treatments, thousands of pages documenting every procedure, every death, every failed experiment. But here's the strange part. In 1943, an entire year's worth of medical records vanished, just gone. Every document from January to December 1943 disappeared, and the hospital never explained why. What happened in 1943 that they needed to erase? Some former staff members who were interviewed years later hinted at something dark. They talked about a basement wing that was off limits to most personnel. They mentioned patients being taken down there who never came back. They described screams coming from that section of the building at night, screams that didn't sound like tuberculosis patients. In 1961, an investigative journalist tried to get access to Waverly Hills basement records. He was found dead in his hotel room 3 days later. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but the journalist was 34 years old with no history of heart problems. Then, in 1961, something changed. The development of antibiotics finally gave doctors a real weapon against tuberculosis. The death rate at Waverly Hills plummeted. Within a few years, the sanatorium was nearly empty. In 1962, Waverly Hills closed its doors as a tuberculosis hospital. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but it's not. Because what came next was somehow even worse. In 1962, the state of Kentucky reopened Waverly Hills as a geriatric facility called Woodhaven Medical Services. It was supposed to be a peaceful place for elderly patients to live out their final years. Instead, it became a nightmare of abuse and neglect that makes the tuberculosis era look humane by comparison. Within months of opening, reports started leaking out. Patients were being electroshocked without consent. They were left in restraints for days. They were beaten by staff. The facility was chronically understaffed and underfunded. Patients lived in filth, often lying in their own waste for hours. Many were malnourished despite the state sending funding for proper meals. But here's the thing that nobody could explain. Patients kept dying at an alarming rate, far higher than other geriatric facilities. And many of these deaths were labeled as accidents or natural causes without proper investigation. A patient would fall down the stairs. Another would accidentally overdose on medication. Another would simply be found dead in their bed with no clear cause. In 1980, the state finally sent investigators. What they found was so disturbing that the full report was never made public. Only a redacted version was released, and even that was horrifying. It documented widespread abuse, financial fraud, and mysterious patient deaths that had gone uninvestigated for years. Woodhaven was shut down in 1982. The building was abandoned, left to rot on that hill overlooking Louisville. And that's when things got really strange. Within weeks of the building being abandoned, local police started receiving reports. People driving past the property at night claimed to see lights moving inside the building, even though there was no electricity. Others reported hearing screams coming from inside. Security guards who were hired to patrol the property refused to enter the building after dark. Some quit after a single night. One security guard gave an interview to a local newspaper in 1983. He said he was doing his rounds on the 4th floor when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw a woman in a white nurse's uniform standing at the end of the hallway. She was soaking wet, even though it hadn't rained in days. He called out to her, and she turned and walked straight through a wall. The guard quit that night and refused to ever go back. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Waverly Hills became a magnet for urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers. Breaking into the abandoned hospital became a rite of passage for Louisville teenagers. But a lot of people who went inside came out changed. There were consistent reports of the same phenomena. In room 502, people heard voices. They felt hands touching them in the darkness. Cameras would malfunction. People experienced sudden, overwhelming feelings of dread that made them flee the room. In the Body Chute, people reported seeing shadows moving along the walls, shadows that looked like bodies being dragged. Some claimed to hear the sound of the motorized rail car still running, decades after it had been removed. On the 4th floor, people consistently reported seeing the ghost of a little girl named Mary. According to hospital records, Mary was brought to Waverly Hills in 1935 when she was 7 years old. She died 3 months later. Dozens of people over the years have reported seeing her playing with a ball in the hallway or hearing her calling out for her mother. But the most disturbing reports came from the basement, from that mysterious wing that had been off limits during the hospital's operation. People who ventured down there described an overwhelming sense of evil. They talked about seeing dark figures, feeling hands grabbing at them, hearing voices telling them to leave. Several people claimed to have been physically pushed or scratched by something they couldn't see. A paranormal investigation team went into the basement in 1994 with full video equipment. 3 hours into their investigation, all 4 team members came running out of the building in a panic. They packed up their equipment and left immediately, refusing to talk about what they'd experienced. The footage they recorded was never released, but one team member later said they captured something on camera that shouldn't exist, something that made them question everything they believed about reality. Now, remember room 502, the room that had been sealed since 1932? In 1996, a group of urban explorers decided they were going to break into it and see what was inside. It took them hours to break through the sealed door. When they finally got it open, this is what they found. The room was exactly as it had been left in 1932. The bed was still there, made up with rotting linens. There was a nurse's cap on the dresser. And on the walls, written in what appeared to be dried blood, were hundreds of words covering every surface. Names, dates. The words, "I'm sorry," repeated over and over again. And one phrase, written larger than all the others above the door. We didn't know what we were doing, but that's not what scared them. What scared them was the medical equipment. In the corner of the room was a surgical table with restraints, and next to it was a full set of surgical instruments, all covered in rust and what looked like dried blood. Why would there be surgery equipment in a nurse's room? Why would it need restraints? The explorers took photographs and left quickly, all of them deeply unsettled by what they'd seen. When they tried to publish the photos online, they received a legal threat from an anonymous lawyer demanding they take the images down. They complied immediately, and the photos have never been seen publicly. What was happening in room 502 that required surgery equipment and restraints? And why would someone want those photos suppressed decades after the hospital closed? In 2001, Waverly Hills was purchased by a couple who were determined to restore it and preserve its history. They started giving historical tours and allowing paranormal investigation teams to study the building. The new owners have been open about the hospital's dark past, but there are still questions they can't or won't answer. They've confirmed that yes, room 502 existed. Yes, 2 nurses did die there under mysterious circumstances. But they claim that when they took possession of the building, room 502 was empty, no surgical equipment, no writing on the walls, nothing. So either the urban explorers in 1996 were lying, or someone cleaned out that room very thoroughly between 1996 and 2001. The new owners also commissioned a full historical audit of the building's records. The researchers found something disturbing. The official death toll at Waverly Hills is listed as approximately 63,000 deaths over the 52 years it operated. But when researchers tried to match that number against actual death certificates filed with the county, they could only account for about 42,000 deaths. That means there are roughly 21,000 people who died at Waverly Hills Sanatorium who have no official death certificate on record. Where are the records for those 21,000 people? What happened to them? Were they ever officially recorded at all? The missing records raise an even darker question. Were all 63,000 people who died at Waverly Hills actually tuberculosis patients? Or was something else happening there? Were some of those deaths from the medical experiments? Or some of them from the basement wing that nobody was allowed to enter? In 2008, a paranormal investigation team was filming in the basement when they captured something on their infrared camera that has never been explained. The footage shows a dark, human-shaped mass moving through a hallway at an impossible speed, easily 40 or 50 miles per hour. It appears to move through walls. The footage was analyzed by video experts who confirmed it hadn't been tampered with. No one has ever provided a rational explanation for what that footage shows. The current owners of Waverly Hills maintain that while the building has a tragic history, most of the paranormal claims are exaggerated. But even they admit there are things they can't explain. They've had staff quit because of experiences in the building. They've had security cameras capture bizarre anomalies. They've heard the footsteps, the voices, the sounds of things moving in empty rooms. One of the owners gave an interview in 2015 where he made a fascinating admission. He said there are parts of the building they still haven't fully explored. There are sections of the basement that are too dangerous to enter because of structural damage, and there are rooms that are locked where they've never found the keys. What might still be in those unexplored areas? What might be locked away in those rooms? Here's what we know for certain. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was a place where over 60,000 people died, most of them in agony, many of them subjected to brutal experimental treatments that would be considered torture today. It was a place where bodies were secretly hauled away through a tunnel because the sight of death had become too much for the living to bear. It was a place where nurses died under mysterious circumstances, where medical records disappeared, where entire wings were off limits to most staff. After it closed as a tuberculosis hospital, it became a geriatric facility where patients were abused, neglected, and died under suspicious circumstances for 20 years before the state finally shut it down. And now, it sits there on that hill, a massive Gothic building that has witnessed more death and suffering than almost any other structure in America. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying that something lingers in that place. Too many people over too many years have experienced things they can't explain. The most disturbing part, we may never know the full truth about what happened at Waverly Hills. Too many records are missing, too many witnesses are dead, too many secrets were buried along with the patients. But room 502 remains, and if you're ever brave enough to stand in that room where 2 nurses died, where surgery equipment was found, where someone wrote, "We didn't know what we were doing," on the walls in blood, you might just discover that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because whatever happened in that room, whatever experiments were conducted in that basement, whatever caused 21,000 people to die without official death certificates, someone went to great lengths to make sure we'd never find out. And that might be the most terrifying part of all.